The boot came through the front window at 6 in the morning. Glass exploded across the counter, across the stools, across the linoleum floor that Walter Briggs had mopped himself 4 hours earlier. A coffee pot shattered against the tile wall. Brown liquid ran in slow rivers down the white surface and dripped off the edge of the counter onto the floor. Outside, someone laughed. Then a second man stepped through the broken frame boots, crunching over the glass, and behind him came a third. The third man wore a suit. Walter Briggs sat in the corner booth. He had been sitting there since 4 in the morning. He had a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him, 3 strips of bacon on the side, a cup of black coffee he had brewed himself before the sun came up. He was reading a folded newspaper. He did not look up when the window broke. He did not stand when the 3 men came through. He turned a page of the newspaper. He picked up his fork. The man in the crowd walked to the center of the diner and stood there looking around at the place the way a man looks at something he has already decided he owns. He was 38 years old, tan from a tanning bed, a watch on his wrist that cost more than most men in this county made in a year. His suit had been tailored in a city far from here. His shoes had never touched dirt until this morning. His name was Preston Harlow. He picked up a sugar shaker from the nearest table and turned it upside down over the floor. The sugar fanned out in a white arc across the gray linoleum. The 2 men behind him, younger, thick-necked, wearing jeans and work boots, started in on the place. One of them knocked a row of ceramic mugs off the back shelf. They exploded against the floor one after another, the sound of each one sharp and flat in the still morning air. The other man picked up a chair and threw it through what remained of the front window. More glass, more sound. Walter turned another page. Preston walked toward the corner booth. His shoes crunched over broken ceramic. He stopped at the edge of Walter's table, looked down at the old man sitting there reading his newspaper, eating his eggs as though nothing in the world had changed. "Look at me," he said. Walter looked up. He set down his fork. He looked at Preston Harlow with the kind of eyes that had been looking at things like Preston Harlow for 50 years. Not angry eyes, not frightened eyes. The eyes of a man making a careful, unhurried list. "I gave you every chance," Preston said. He kicked the edge of the table. Walter's plate slid sideways. Egg yolk ran across the surface and dripped over the edge onto the leather of his vest. Walter looked at the yolk on his vest. He looked back up at Preston. "You're going to sign today," Preston said, "or my boys come back tomorrow, and the day after, until there's nothing left here worth defending." Walter said nothing. Preston leaned across the table. His cologne filled the space between them. "My lawyer will be here by noon," he said. "You sign or we escalate. You understand what that means." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached down with a paper napkin and dabbed the egg yolk off the leather of his vest. He folded the napkin. He set it on the table. Preston straightened up. He turned toward the wall where the flag hung. It had been hanging there for 19 years. It was not a large flag, 3 feet by 5. The colors had faded in places, the red deepened. The blue gone gray at the edges. In the upper left corner, where the fabric had darkened unevenly, the stain had been there since 2003. Walter had never washed it out. He had never tried. Preston looked at the flag. His 2 men had stopped their destruction and were watching. "You think this makes you patriotic?" Preston said. "Hanging this filthy thing on the wall." He walked over to it. He grabbed it by the edge. The small brass hook tore through the fabric where it had been looped. He pulled the flag down. He dropped it on the floor. He stepped on it with the heel of his tailored shoe, ground his weight into it, and turned back toward Walter. That was when something changed. Not in Walter's face. Not visibly. There was no flash of anger, no sharp intake of breath, no clenching of the jaw. What changed was something underneath all of that. Something deep and structural, the way the earth shifts long before anything on the surface moves. A man reaching the end of a very long rope and not grabbing it, just watching it go. Maya did not see it. Preston was already walking toward the door, already signaling to his men, already composed, already finished with this. Walter spoke quietly, just loud enough. "You shouldn't have touched that flag, son." Preston stopped. He turned around slowly. "What did you just say to me?" Walter repeated it. Same quiet voice, same calm. "You shouldn't have touched that flag." Preston walked back. He grabbed the collar of Walter's leather vest with both hands and hauled him halfway out of the booth, brought his face within 4 inches of Walter's. The cologne again. The watch catching the light. Preston's eyes were the eyes of a man who had never, not once in his life, been made to face a consequence that he had not been able to buy or talk or charm his way out of. Or what he said, "You gonna do something? Look at you. You're a 67-year-old man with egg on his jacket. What are you gonna do?" Walter looked at him, not with rage, with something closer to recognition. The way you look at a thing when you finally understand what it is. The way a man who has seen real violence looks at someone performing the idea of violence and feels not fear, but something like exhaustion at the distance between those two things. Preston slapped him, open-handed hard enough that Walter's head turned and a thin cut opened on his lower lip. Walter turned his face back, looked at Preston again, said nothing. Preston shoved him back into the booth. He straightened his jacket. He spit on the floor. "Sign the papers today," he said, "or tomorrow we burn this place to the ground." He turned, pointed at his men, and walked out. Boots through broken glass. The bell above the door clanged once hard against the frame as the door swung. Outside, a van engine turned over. Headlights swept across the broken window. Then it drove away. The diner was quiet. Walter sat in the booth for a moment. Blood on his lip, egg on his vest, glass everywhere. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded white handkerchief. He pressed it against his lip, looked at the small stain of red that came back on the cloth. He folded the handkerchief and returned it to his pocket. He stood. He moved slowly the way men his age move after sitting still, each joint remembering its objections. He walked to the center of the room to where the flag lay on the floor pressed under the boot print of Preston Harlow's right shoe. He crouched down. He picked it up with both hands, careful about the way his hands came under it. He smoothed the fabric. He began to fold it, corner over corner, point to point, the way they had shown him in basic training in 1975, the way they had folded the one at the funeral. He set the folded flag on the counter. He walked back to his booth. He sat down. He picked up his coffee cup. The coffee was still warm. He looked out through the destroyed front of his diner at the desert beginning to lighten at its edges, the sky above the saguaro going from black to the color of a bruise. A semi rolled past on Route 93, its running lights orange against the gray. A bird landed on a fence post and was gone. The world continuing. He set the coffee cup down. He exhaled. His shoulders dropped. He looked like an old man sitting alone in a broken place with nothing left to defend. Ruth's truck pulled into the lot. She had been his waitress for 20 years, 63 years old. A pink uniform she washed every night and pressed every morning because she believed a thing worth doing was worth doing right. She was carrying a paper bag with 6 biscuits she had baked at home before coming in, same as she had done every morning for as long as Walter had known her. She came to the door and stopped. "Walt, oh my God." He looked up. She came inside, carefully stepping around the glass. Her eyes moving from the broken window to the shattered mugs, to the egg on his vest, to the cut on his lip, to the folded flag on the counter. She touched the edge of the folded flag with one finger. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. "Should I call the sheriff?" He shook his head. "No sheriff." She looked at him for a long moment. She had been looking at Walter Briggs for 20 years. She had seen him in every mood a man is capable of. She had never seen this one, this particular quiet. "Walt," she said, "what are you going to do?" He looked at her. A small smile came to the corner of his mouth the way a flame comes back to a wick it was never fully gone from. He said, "I'm going to finish my coffee." And he picked up the cup and drank. She went to the back room to get a broom. He finished the coffee. He set the cup down. He stood, walked behind the counter to the wall-mounted telephone that had been there since the 1980s, the rotary dial worn smooth from 40 years of use. He picked up the receiver. He dialed 7 digits from memory. It rang twice. Somebody picked up. Walter spoke 6 words. "It's Walt. The diner. Need brothers." 2 seconds of silence, then 1 word in reply. "Yeah." He hung up. He dialed again. Said the same thing, then again. He made 9 phone calls in 7 minutes. After the last one, he hung up the receiver and stood for a moment with his hand still resting on it, looking at nothing. Then he walked back to his booth, sat down, and picked up his newspaper. Now let me back up. Let me tell you who Walter Briggs is. Because this story doesn't make sense, it doesn't carry its full weight, unless you understand what kind of man was sitting in that corner booth that morning and what kind of weight he had been carrying every day for the past 19 years. Walter Earl Briggs was born in Casper, Wyoming in 1957. His father worked the oil fields. His mother taught third grade. He had one brother, Danny, 7 years younger, born in 1964. Danny was the kind of kid who followed his older brother everywhere, who wanted to do everything Walter did, who wore Walter's old clothes and borrowed Walter's old bicycle, and fell asleep on Saturday nights watching whatever game Walter had on. Walter enlisted in the Marines in 1975 at 18. He did 2 tours, came home in 1979, spent a few years working construction in Nevada, drifting a little before the bikes found him. He had been riding since the mid-70s, the way a lot of men his age had been riding, as something that was both freedom and structure at the same time. By 1982, he was patched in. By 1986, he was a chapter officer. By 1994, he was the chapter president of the Arizona Nomads, which was not a chapter with a fixed territory, but a chapter that moved, that appeared where it was needed, that had members in every major city, from Phoenix to Tucson to Flagstaff to Albuquerque. The men in the Brotherhood did not call him Walter. They called him Iron Walt, because the story was that nothing got through, not pain, not loss, not the kind of grief that follows a man like a second shadow, not the years, not the weather. But let me tell you about Danny. Danny Briggs grew up watching his big brother. When Walter enlisted, Danny told everyone in his high school class that he was going to do the same thing. When Walter came home from the Marines with a certain kind of quiet in him, Danny noticed that quiet and filed it away. When Walter drifted to Arizona and started building a life, Danny went to college, got a degree in civil engineering, married a woman named Louise in 1995, had a son named Cole in 1998. After September of 2001, Danny put in his papers. He was 37 years old. Louise argued with him for 3 weeks. He enlisted anyway. He told her that Walter had done 2 tours and come home fine. He told her he couldn't stay on the sideline. He deployed to Afghanistan in March of 2003. He was killed in Kandahar province in September of 2004. An IED on a road he had been down a dozen times. He was 40 years old. His son Cole was 6. Walter got the call on a Wednesday morning. He was sitting in his apartment in Flagstaff. The Army chaplain spoke in a steady, practiced voice. Walter listened. He said, "Thank you." He hung up. He sat in his chair for a very long time. He drove to Wyoming for the funeral. He stood with Louise and Cole at the graveside. He was in his dress uniform, the one he had not worn in 25 years, which still fit because Walter Briggs had never stopped being the man who wore it. When they folded the flag over Danny's casket and brought it to Louise, Louise looked at Walter and something passed between them, and she put the flag in his hands instead of her own. He drove back to Arizona with the flag folded in the passenger seat beside him. In 2005, he bought a failing diner off Route 93 just outside Wickenburg, Arizona. 22 seats, 6 booths, a counter with 8 stools. The building had been a hardware store before that, and a feed store before that, and the walls still smelled faintly of old wood and old work. He opened it on a Tuesday morning in April. The coffee was ready by 5. The grill was on by 5:30. The first thing he did before he unlocked the front door was hang the flag on the wall behind the counter. He found the right height, drove the brass hook himself, smoothed the fabric flat. He stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then he went to unlock the door. That flag had been on that wall for 19 years. He had thought in the weeks after Danny died that he might not survive the grief. Not in any dramatic sense. He was not a man who entertained dramatic thoughts. But there was a period of about 4 months in the winter of 2004 into 2005 where he understood, for the first time in his life, what it meant when people said they had lost the will to get out of bed. Not because he was weak, because the thing that had made the world worth facing in the morning had been removed, and what was left was a version of the world that bore all the same features, but lacked the essential element that had made those features matter. Danny had been that element, not in a way Walter had ever put into words, not even to himself. But Danny had been the person who made Walter's life legible, the younger brother who had looked up to him, who had followed him, who had carried forward something of what Walter was into a generation Walter would not otherwise have touched. When Danny died, Walter lost not just a brother, but the evidence of his own worth. The diner was what came after. He bought it with the money from selling the Flagstaff apartment and a loan from a man in the Brotherhood who did not charge interest and did not set a repayment schedule and simply said, "Call me when you are ready." He spent 6 weeks gutting and rebuilding it, doing most of the work himself, learning the rest as he went. He built the counter by hand from reclaimed oak. He tiled the walls himself, white subway tile. He laid in a grid that was not perfectly level because he was not a professional, but close enough that no one who was not looking for the flaw would find it. He opened on a Tuesday morning in April 2005 with a handwritten sign on the door that said Briggs Diner and a menu of 6 items, none of which he had ever cooked for anyone other than himself. The first customer was a man named Gerald who drove a propane delivery truck and stopped because he needed coffee and the lights were on. Walter poured him a cup and Gerald said it was good and left $1 on the counter, and that was that. The diner grew slowly. Regulars found it. Word went around. By the end of the first year, Walter had a full house on weekday mornings and needed help, which was how Ruth came to work there. She had heard about the place from her husband Cleve, who had heard about it through the Brotherhood, and she had walked in one morning and told Walter she could waitress and cook if needed, and that she was available starting Monday. Walter had looked at her for a moment and said Monday was fine. Cleve had been a Hell's Angel, a man who had ridden with Walter for 15 years before a cardiac arrest took him in 2011 at the age of 59. Ruth had stayed on at the diner after Cleve died because she had nowhere else she wanted to be, and because Walter never asked her to go, and because the diner felt like the thing that was left of the life she had built. She knew what the flag was. She had never said so to anyone. That was the deal, though neither of them had ever stated it out loud. The stain in the upper left corner of the flag was Danny's blood. Not from the IED, from a training exercise the year before he deployed, when Danny had cut his palm on a piece of equipment and wiped his hand on the flag without thinking. Danny had apologized for it. Walter had told him it was fine. And when Danny was gone, that stain became the most important thing in the room. To anyone walking in cold, Walter looked like an old biker, graybeard, down to his collarbone, long silver hair, tied back black leather vest over a faded flannel work boots he had been wearing for at least 12 years. The patches on that vest, if you knew what to look for, told a different story. The top rocker and bottom rocker and center patch, the death's head with wings, and in red beneath it, 3 letters that were not available for purchase. The kind of patches a man earns over 43 years. The kind of patches that meant something specific in every state west of the Mississippi. Most people in Wickenburg knew Walter as the quiet old man at the diner who made good eggs and didn't talk much. A few knew he was a Hell's Angel. Almost none of them knew he was the president of the Arizona Nomads and had been for 30 years. Now let me tell you about Preston Harlow. Preston Harlow was born in Boston in 1986 to a family that had money in the quiet generational way that old East Coast money tends to work. His father was an investment banker. His mother organized charity galas and served on the boards of cultural institutions. Preston went to prep school, went to a good university, graduated with a degree in finance, and moved to Phoenix in his mid-20s with the idea that the Southwest was an underdeveloped market and that he was the man to develop it. He was not entirely wrong. He had a good eye for undervalued properties and the willingness to act quickly, and by his mid-30s, he had built a real estate portfolio that was impressive on paper and occasionally aggressive in practice. He had a corner office on the 17th floor of a glass building in downtown Phoenix. He had a wife named Diana whom he had met at a charity event in Scottsdale 7 years earlier, and who came from a family she described as having deep roots in the Southwest, a description Preston had never pushed on. He had grown up with money and educated himself among people with money and married into more money, and somewhere in that process he had reached a conclusion about himself that was not quite accurate. He believed he was self-made. He believed that his success was the product of his own intelligence and his own will, and that people who could not see this were either envious or simply not paying attention. He believed in the way that men who have never been truly tested believe that he was capable of handling anything. He had met Diana at a charity gala for a children's hospital in Scottsdale. She had been introduced to him as Diana Boone, and she was beautiful and composed, and clearly from a family with roots here, and Preston had been charmed by the combination of those things. They had dated for 8 months and married in a ceremony at a resort outside Sedona. Her father had come to the wedding, a large, quiet man in a dark suit who had shaken Preston's hand and looked at him with an expression Preston had interpreted as approval, but which, if he had been paying closer attention, might have read as assessment. He had never asked Diana much about her father. He knew the man rode motorcycles and lived somewhere outside Phoenix and called Diana on her birthday and at Christmas. He had been to their house for dinner 3 times in 7 years. Preston found him difficult to talk to, not unfriendly exactly, but contained in a way that made Preston feel uncomfortably like he was the one being judged rather than the one doing the judging. He had never made the connection. It had not occurred to him to make the connection, because Preston Harlow lived in a world that was divided into the important and the unimportant, and old men who rode motorcycles and lived outside Phoenix and were not wealthy fell clearly and completely into the second category. This was the foundational error. Everything else followed from it. He had bought the strip mall on Route 93 6 months earlier. He had bought it as part of a larger acquisition strategy, identifying properties along developing commercial corridors and assembling them into parcels large enough for chain hotel development. He had paid below market value for the property because the previous owner was behind on taxes and needed to move quickly. Of the 4 tenants in the strip mall, 3 had accepted his buyout offer within the first 2 months. The 4th had not. The 4th was Walter's diner. Preston had sent 3 certified letters. Walter had not responded to them. Preston had sent his lawyer, a man named Kevin, who charged $400 an hour, to sit across from Walter in the corner booth and explain the situation in legal terms. Walter had told Kevin the eggs were on the house, but the diner was not for sale. Kevin had driven back to Phoenix and billed Preston for 3 hours. Preston had raised his offer, then raised it again. The second offer was triple the assessed value of the property. Walter had said no to both. 2 weeks before the morning with the boots and the broken glass, Preston had driven out to the diner himself. He had sat across from Walter in the corner booth, his fingers drumming on the tabletop, and he had made his final offer in the direct, confident language of a man who believes the person across from him simply does not understand the scale of the opportunity being presented. Walter had looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup. He had said one thing: "Son, this place is the only thing in this world that's still mine, and there's not enough money in your bank to buy it." Preston had laughed. He had leaned across the table. He had said, "Old man, I don't need your signature. I'll get you out of here, one way or another." Walter had nodded, had drunk his coffee, had said nothing. Preston had driven back to Phoenix. He had spent the weekend at his country club. He had played golf and had drinks on the patio and told a couple of friends about the stubborn old biker who wouldn't sell, and his friends had laughed and told him the guy would come around. They always did. On Monday morning, Preston made a phone call to 2 men who worked for him doing the kind of work that did not appear on any invoice. He told them to bring tire irons. He told them to meet him at the diner at 6 in the morning before the regulars came in. He told them they were going to remind the old man that some decisions were not his to make. That was Preston Harlow's first mistake. He would make several more before the week was out. The thing about Preston's mistake was not that he had hired 2 men to come and destroy someone's property. That was bad enough. The real mistake was this: he had not asked anyone about Walter Briggs. He had not asked Kevin the lawyer. He had not asked the previous owner of the strip mall. He had not asked anyone in Wickenburg. He had not done what any man with any instinct for self-preservation would have done, which was to ask around to find out who the man was, to understand who he was dealing with before he showed up in the early morning dark with 2 employees carrying tire irons. If he had asked, he would have learned. People in Wickenburg talked around it, but they knew. The mechanics at the garage on the south end of town knew. The hardware store owner knew. The woman who ran the feed store 3 miles down Route 93 knew. They all knew, in the way small towns know things, not always the details, not always the full picture, but the essential truth of a man's gravity. Ironwalt, they would have said, not someone you push. But Preston Harlow was 38 years old and had spent his entire life in rooms where he was the most important person present. And so he had not asked and he had not learned. And at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, he had walked through the broken window of a man's diner and done the worst thing he could have done. He had put his shoe on Danny Briggs' flag. Back in the booth, Walter sat reading his newspaper while Ruth swept glass in the back. By the time she came out again with the broom, he was already behind the counter, already at the phone. She heard the low murmur of his voice. She heard him dial 9 times. She heard the same words each time, quiet and precise and without inflection. "It's Walt. The diner. Need brothers." She stopped sweeping. She stood still for a moment in the middle of the broken diner with the broom in her hands, and she understood what those 9 phone calls meant. She had been the wife of a Hell's Angel for 16 years. She had watched the phone calls go out before. Not often, twice in 16 years with Cleve. But she knew what came after. She looked at the folded flag on the counter. She looked at the empty hook on the wall where it had hung. She set down her broom. She went to the back and started a fresh pot of coffee because there were going to be a lot of men here soon, and men who have been riding since before dawn always want coffee when they arrive. Walter came back to his booth. He sat down. He picked up the newspaper. He read for a while. Then he set the paper aside and looked at the desert out through the empty frame of the broken window. In the upper left area of his vest, over his chest, there was a small rectangular lump under the leather where the inside pocket was sewn. In that pocket was a dog tag on a faded ball chain. The metal was scuffed at the edges from 20 years of being carried. The stamped letters on it read, Briggs Danny R., and a service number, and a religion, and a blood type. The information a soldier carries about himself in case someone needs to identify what is left. Walter had carried it every day since the funeral. He touched the outside of his vest over the pocket briefly with 2 fingers. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank. The first bike rolled into the parking lot at 6:40, then another, then 3 more in a tight formation, then 2, then 5. By 7 o'clock, there were 12 motorcycles outside the diner. By 8, there were 30. By 9, there were 54. They came from Phoenix, from Tucson, from Flagstaff, from Albuquerque, from Sedona, from Yuma. Some had ridden through the night. Some had been on their way to other places and turned around. Some were retired men in their late 60s and early 70s who had not ridden in months, who had gone to their garages in the dark before dawn and rolled out bikes that had been sitting under tarps and gotten them started and headed down the highway because the call had gone out. When the call went out from Ironwalt, you came. That was not a rule that was written anywhere. It was simply understood the way certain things are understood among men who have ridden together for decades, who have been to each other's worst moments and helped carry each other's dead. Ruth watched them arrive through the empty window frame. She had put on another pot of coffee, and then another after that. A few of the men came inside, filled cups, thanked her quietly, and went back out. They were not rough with her. They were not loud. They were men in their 50s and 60s, most of them gray-bearded, wearing their colors, and they moved through the broken diner with a kind of careful respect that Ruth recognized. She had seen it before at funerals. The way men move when they know something serious is about to happen. Walter walked out into the parking lot at 9:15. He wore the clean vest that his vice president had brought him in a saddlebag, the identical patches on the back, the same faded threads, the same 3 letters in red. He had washed the egg off his face. The cut on his lip was still there, small and sealed. He walked out and every man turned toward him. He walked the line. He shook every hand. He did not make a speech. He spoke to each man quietly a few words, and each man nodded, and each man's face settled into the same expression, the one that comes when a man understands what he is being asked and what it means. Walter pointed at the broken window. He pointed at the folded flag on the counter inside. Each man looked. Each man understood. A black SUV pulled into the lot and a big man got out. Bald, 65 years old, 6'2", 240 pounds, with a gray beard and a face that had been worn down by weather and time into something that resembled a landscape more than a face. His name was Boone. His full name was Raymond Clarence Boone, and he had been riding with Walter Briggs since 1973 and had served as vice president of the Arizona Nomads since 1994. And there was not a man in the chapter who did not believe that if something ever happened to Walter Boone, was the only one who could hold what they had built together. Boone walked across the lot to Walter. He stood in front of him for a moment, looking at the cut lip and the clean vest, and the particular expression on Walter's face that Boone had seen twice in the 50 years of knowing him. He looked through the window at the folded flag. He said, "Who?" Walter said, "Preston Harlow. Real estate. Phoenix." Boone said, "Address." Walter gave it to him. Boone looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "We riding now or later?" Walter said, "Let me eat first." Boone nodded. He walked back to the SUV. He got on the radio. Inside, Ruth had made Walter a fresh plate of eggs. He sat in his booth and ate them slowly and drank a third cup of coffee while outside the parking lot continued to fill. By 10 o'clock, the count was over 70 bikes. Boone came back inside and sat across from Walter. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Boone said something. He said, "Walt, there's something you need to know." Walter looked up from his eggs. Boone said it slowly, like a man choosing each word from a very small supply. He said, "Preston Harlow's wife, her name is Diana. Her last name before she married him was Boone." The fork in Walter's hand went still. Boone looked at the table. He said, "She's my daughter." The diner was quiet around them, glass still on the floor in the corners where Ruth had not swept. The morning light coming through the broken window frame, pale and flat. Walter said, "Does she know about who I am?" Boone shook his head. "She knows I ride. She knows I have brothers. She doesn't know your name or what you're the president of." I never told her the details. I kept that part of my life separate from her because I didn't want it to touch her. Walter said, "Does she know what her husband did this morning?" Boone said, "Not yet." They sat with that for a moment. Walter looked at the folded flag on the counter. He looked at the empty hook on the wall. He looked at Boone, who was looking at his own hands on the table. Walter said, "That doesn't change what happens today." Boone said, "I know." Walter said, "But it changes how?" Boone looked up. Walter's face had the expression that people who knew him well recognized as the one that meant he had already decided, had already worked out what was necessary, and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Walter said, "She should know who she married, not because I want to hurt her, because she deserves to know." Boone said nothing for a moment. Then quietly he said, "Yeah." Walter finished his eggs. He drank the last of his coffee. He set the cup down precisely in the center of its saucer. He stood up. He walked outside. 73 men standing around their bikes in the morning sun of an October day in the Arizona desert turned toward him. Walter looked at them for a moment. He said, "Thank you, brothers. Mount up." 73 engines already started. The sound of it filled the lot and rolled out across the desert scrubland and up into the pale blue morning sky like something announcing itself. Walter threw his leg over a Harley that Boone's son had trailered out and tuned the night before. He kicked it to life. He pulled to the front of the lot. He looked both ways on Route 93. He pulled out. The formation fell in behind him. 2 by 2, precise and unhurried, the way men fall into formation when they have done it 100 times and do not need to think about it. 73 motorcycles in a column that stretched back a quarter-mile on the desert highway. The kind of formation that makes people on the roadside stop and look. The kind of formation that gets called into highway dispatch. 3 Arizona State Patrol cars showed up before they had gone 20 miles. The lead trooper, a woman named Reyes, who had been on the Route 93 corridor for 8 years, pulled up alongside Walter and rolled down her window. She looked at him. She looked at the column stretching behind him as far as she could see in both directions. She said one word. "Walt." He looked at her. He said, "Morning, Reyes." She looked at him for a moment. Something passed across her face that was not quite the expression of a law enforcement officer evaluating a traffic situation. It was something more personal, more careful. She said, "Everything all right out here?" Walter said, "It will be." She nodded once. She rolled up her window. The patrol cars peeled off at the next interchange and did not return. You see, Walter Briggs had spent 40 years doing things for people. Not always things that appeared in any official record. Sometimes the things he did were the kind of things that a man needed done and that no official mechanism existed to do. He had helped people in ways that had nothing to do with his motorcycle or his patches. He had sat with men who were about to lose everything and helped them not lose it. He had gone to places other people would not go. He had stood up in moments when standing up meant something real. Some of those people now wore badges. Some sat on city councils. Some served on the boards of institutions. Not because Walter had asked them for anything, but because when a man does certain things over a long enough period of time, the world around him changes in ways that are invisible until the moment when they are suddenly and completely visible. The column rolled into the outer edges of downtown Phoenix at 12:20 in the afternoon. Office workers stopped on the sidewalks. People held up phones. A cluster of people outside a lunch restaurant stood with their sandwiches forgotten in their hands, watching the line of bikes roll past. By 12:30, video was on the internet. By 12:45, it had been shared several hundred times. The bikes pulled up around the glass building where Preston had his office. They did not block the streets. They did not create a disturbance. They parked in the available spaces and along the curb in a configuration that was calm and deliberate and that surrounded the building on three sides. 73 men on 73 bikes, all of them wearing colors, all of them quiet. Walter cut his engine. He sat on the bike for a moment. He looked up at the glass building, 17 floors of it, reflecting the afternoon sky. He got off the bike. He put the kickstand down. Boone fell in beside him. Two other senior men flanked them. They walked through the glass doors into the lobby without hurrying. The lobby receptionist looked up. She saw four large men in motorcycle vests. She saw the patches. She looked at Walter's face. She reached for the phone on her desk and then appeared to reconsider, to see something in the quality of their movement. Unhurried, purposeful, the kind of movement that did not need to be loud because it was already certain of its destination. And she set the phone back down. Walter stopped at the desk. He said quietly, "What floor is Preston Harlow on?" She said 17, "But Mr. Harlow is not." "Thank you," Walter said. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. Boone stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. The elevator came. They got in. Walter pressed 17. The doors closed. The elevator rose. Inside the elevator, in the silence of the rising, Walter looked at his reflection in the polished steel of the elevator door. Gray beard, silver hair, cut on his lips, small and sealed now. Leather vest with the patches that told his whole life in abbreviated symbols. He looked like an old man. He looked like what the world had made of him over 67 years. He thought about Danny. He thought about the morning in September 2004 when the chaplain had called. He thought about the flag on the passenger seat beside him on the drive to Wyoming, folded in its triangle, steady in the curves. He thought about Louise's face when she put it in his hands instead of her own. He thought about 6-year-old Cole standing at the graveside, not quite understanding. Not quite not understanding. He thought about 19 years of getting up at 4 in the morning. 19 years of making the cavity, warming the grill, setting out the cups. 19 years of the flag on the wall and the morning light coming through the windows and the regulars coming in and going out, the whole slow rhythm of a life built around a fixed point, a thing that was present and permanent, and that said every morning Danny was here. Danny mattered. This is what remains. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. 17th floor. Walter stepped out. The corridor was carpeted, quiet, lined with framed photographs of developments Preston's company had built. Hotels, retail centers, the kind of glass and steel structures that looked identical in every American city they were placed in. Walter walked past them without looking at them. At the end of the corridor, a frosted glass door read, "Harlow Development," in clean sans serif letters. Through the frosted glass, a figure was moving in a way that suggested urgency, a person going from one part of a room to another quickly, the way people move when they have just learned something they wish they had known earlier. Walter put his hand on the door. He stood there for a moment, not hesitating, composing. The way a man composes himself before a thing he has waited for, not because he is uncertain, but because he wants to do it right. He wanted to do this right, not for Preston, not for himself, for Danny, for the flag, for the 19 years of getting up at 4 in the morning and making the coffee and hanging the flag on the wall and carrying the dog tag in his pocket. He opened the door and walked in. Preston Harlow had been having a good morning until approximately 10:15. He had arrived at the office at 8, which was early for him but felt necessary after the diner. There was a satisfying energy to decisiveness, to action taken, and Preston had carried that energy up the elevator and through the frosted glass door and into his corner office with its view of downtown Phoenix and its arrangement of furniture that communicated to anyone who entered that this was the office of a man who had built something. He had a 9 o'clock call with a hotel chain's regional development director that had gone well. He had a 10 o'clock meeting with his finance team that had also gone well. Between those meetings, he had called Diana. He had used the speakerphone on his desk the way he always called her from the office, half his attention on her voice and half on the documents in front of him. He told her what had happened at the diner. He told it as a story, the way men tell stories about confrontations they believe they have won. He described the broken window. He described the old man sitting there with his eggs. He described the flag. He described the slap. He described walking out. He was still laughing when she went quiet. "Diana," he said, "you there?" Her voice when it came back was different. stripped of the usual social warmth, the conversational texture she usually brought to their phone calls. Flat and careful the way a voice goes when a person is working to keep themselves under control. She said, "What did you say his name was?" Preston said, "Some old biker. Briggs. Walter Briggs." There was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. She said, "Preston." He said, "What?" She said, "Get out of the office. Right now. Get in your car. Come home." He laughed. "Diana, come on. He's an old man. I scared him." "It's done." Her voice tightened. She said, "Listen to me. My father has mentioned that name. Walter Briggs. He has said it with a specific kind of tone that he uses for very few things. Do you understand what I am telling you?" He did not understand. He did not want to understand. There was something in what she was saying that required a kind of revision to the narrative of the morning that Preston was not prepared to make. He said, "Honey, calm down. I'll be home for dinner and we can talk about it then." She said, "Preston." He said, "I have a meeting at noon." She hung up. He set the phone face down on his desk. He looked out the window at downtown Phoenix, bright in the morning light. He told himself his wife was being dramatic. He told himself everything was fine. He opened the folder for his noon meeting. He poured himself a scotch at 11:15, which was early even by his standards, but the morning had earned it. The thing about Preston Harlow was that he had developed over 38 years of consistently getting what he wanted, a very powerful capacity for not seeing what was directly in front of him. Not stupidity, something more functional than stupidity. A practiced, willful, selective vision that allowed him to continue moving toward an objective, even when the evidence around that objective had changed significantly. He had used this capacity many times to good effect. There were deals where the evidence suggested he should pull back, and he had not pulled back, and the deal had worked out. There were moments where a smarter reading of the room would have told him to change course, and he had stayed the course and been right. This had reinforced in him a belief that his instincts were superior, that his gut was better than analysis, that the people who worried were the people who lacked his particular form of confidence. What it had not taught him was the difference between situations where confidence was an asset and situations where it was a liability. He had never been in the second kind of situation. Not truly. His worst moments had been financial reversible insured. He was in that situation now. He did not know it. His phone rang again at 11:40. He did not recognize the number. He almost did not answer. Then he did. "Preston." It was Diana. She was not calling from her usual number. She was calling from her father's phone. He recognized the number because it was in his contacts filed under Diana's family, a category he had organized and then largely ignored. He said, "Diana, what?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. It was the voice of someone trying not to be overheard. She said, "Dad is at the diner right now. He was there when you arrived this morning. He is one of them, Preston. He is one of Walter Briggs's men. He has been for 50 years. The folder in Preston's hands did not move. The room did not move. The light through the window did not change. But something in the architecture of Preston's understanding of his own life shifted in a way that was sudden and structural and that could not be unshifted. He said, "What?" She said, "I didn't know how to tell you. I tried to tell you without telling you because I was afraid of what you would think. Dad kept that part of his life separate. He rides motorcycles, you knew that. But I never told you what the patches meant, who those men were, because I thought it didn't matter anymore. I thought the two worlds would never cross." "Preston," she said soon, "I called him when you told me what you did, and he said he was already there. He said he had been there. He said Walter Briggs is the president of the Arizona Nomads and has been for 30 years, and that those men are on their way to Phoenix right now." Preston stood up slowly from his desk. He walked to the window. He looked down at the street 17 floors below. The street was normal, cars, people, a delivery truck double parked on the corner. He said, "How many men?" Dinah said Dad said over 70. Preston did not say anything. Then he said, "Dinah, I need to." She said, "Go home, Preston, please. Just leave the office and go home, and I will figure out what to do, but please leave the office now." He said, "I'll handle it. They're bikers. I'll call my lawyer." She said, "Preston." He said, "I have to go." He hung up. He called Kevin. Kevin's assistant said Kevin was in a deposition. Preston said it was urgent. Kevin came on 2 minutes later in the clipped, careful voice of a man pulled out of something important. Preston explained the situation. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Then Kevin said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Preston said, "Fine." Kevin said, "Did you actually go out there this morning? Did you actually bring two of your guys and did something physical happen?" Preston said, "Nothing serious. I was sending a message." Kevin said, "Preston," and then he stopped. And then he said, "I know Walter Briggs. I know who he is. My office handled a property matter 8 years ago that touched one of his. I did my research then. I don't know why you didn't do yours." He said, "There is no legal mechanism that will help you in the next few hours. If those men are already on their way to Phoenix, they will be there before I can file anything. And frankly, I don't think the filing would help anyway." Preston said, "What does that mean?" Kevin said, "It means call your wife." He hung up. Preston set his phone on his desk. He stood very still. Through the window downtown, Phoenix continued its midday business. He could see far down the street the glint of something. The sun on a windshield, then another, then several. Then a sound reached him through the glass, low and distant, and growing the sound of many engines. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He went through the outer office, through the frosted glass door into the corridor. He went to the elevator. He pressed the down button. The elevator came. He stepped in. At the 5th floor, the elevator stopped. The doors opened. 2 men in leather vests were standing there. They were in their 50s, gray-bearded, wearing colors. They looked at Preston with the patient, unhurried expression of men who have all the time in the world. One of them said, "Mr. Harlow, there's been a change of plans." Preston said, "I'm leaving." The other one said, "I understand, but Mr. Briggs would like a word first." He gestured. "After you." Preston did not move. The first man said quietly, "We can do this 2 ways." Preston got back in the elevator. They rode to the 17th floor. They walked Preston back down the corridor, past the framed photographs, through the frosted glass door, through his outer office, into his corner office. One of the men pulled out Preston's chair from behind his desk. The other man said, "Have a seat." Preston sat. They positioned themselves on either side of the door. Not threatening in any dramatic way, just present, just there. For 15 minutes, Preston sat in his own office chair and waited. He could hear faintly through the window glass the sound of dozens of engines going quiet one by one as the bikes were cut. Then silence. Then from somewhere below, the sound of a door. He thought about Diana's voice. "I didn't know how to tell you." He thought about what that meant. He thought about his father-in-law at the wedding dinner, the big quiet man who had looked at him across the table with that expression Preston had called approval, but which now in retrograde he understood had been something else entirely. The expression of a man deciding to say nothing and wait. He thought about the flag on the floor of the diner. He thought about putting his heel on it. He thought about the old man watching him do it, the way the old man's face had not changed, but something behind it had something deep and structural. He was still thinking about this when the door opened. Walter Briggs walked in. He did not look like a man who had driven 2 hours and led 70 bikes across the Arizona desert on a Tuesday morning. He looked like what he was, which was a 67-year-old man in a leather vest who had made up his mind about something and arrived to carry it out. His gray beard, his silver hair, the cut on his lips small dried, the patches on the vest that Preston could now see with different eyes, the ones that meant things he had not known they meant this morning. Behind him came Boone. Preston saw Boone and understood. The recognition was total and immediate, and it had the quality of a floor falling away. His father-in-law, the quiet man at the wedding, the man who had looked at him across the dinner table and said almost nothing for 7 years. Standing in Preston's office in a leather vest with patches on it behind the man Preston had slapped at 6 in the morning. Boone did not look at Preston. He looked at the floor. He looked at the wall. He looked at everything in the room except Preston. The expression on his face was the expression of a man doing something that costs him. Walter stopped in front of Preston's desk. He looked at Preston for a moment. He set something on the desk. The flag. Not a copy. Not a replacement. The actual flag from the diner wall, the one that had been there for 19 years. The one with the faded colors in the darkened corner, the one Preston had pulled down and dropped on the floor and stepped on with his heel. Walter had brought it. He looked at Preston and said, "You know what that is?" Preston said, "It's a flag." Walter said, "That's right, it's a flag. And I'm going to tell you something about that flag that you're going to listen to very carefully. Because what you did this morning and how this conversation goes depends on whether you understand what you did. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He took out a small metal disc on a faded ball chain. He set it on the desk beside the flag. Briggs Danny R. A service number, a blood type, a religion. Preston looked at the dog tag. He looked at the flag. He looked at Walter. Walter said my brother's name was Danny, Daniel Robert Briggs. He was born in Casper, Wyoming in 1964. He was 7 years younger than me. He followed me into the Marines because that's what younger brothers do when they look up to someone. I tried to talk him out of it after September of 2001. I told him he had a son. I told him he had a wife. He told me he couldn't stay on the sideline. Preston did not speak. Walter said he was killed in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, in September of 2004. He was 40 years old. His son Cole was 6. The Army sent a chaplain to call me on a Wednesday morning, and the chaplain read from a prepared statement in a practiced voice. And when he was done, I said thank you, and I hung up and I sat in my chair for a very long time. A sound came into the room from far below, faint and low. The sound of dozens of men waiting in a parking lot. The sound of a patient in collective presence. Walter said that flag draped his casket. His wife was going to take it. She held out her hands and then she looked at me and she put it in my hands instead. I don't know why she did that. I think she knew what I would do with it. He looked at the flag on the desk. I hung it on the wall the day I opened the diner in 2005. Every man who ever came through the Brotherhood in Arizona has stood in front of that flag. They know what it is. They know whose it is. Some of them knew Danny, some of them didn't. It doesn't matter. The flag is the flag. He looked at Preston. This morning you came into my diner and you broke my property and you put your hands on me and then you picked up that flag and you threw it on the floor and you put your shoe on it. Preston was very still. Walter said, I'm not asking you to feel bad about it. I'm telling you what happened. I'm telling you so that you understand what the rest of this conversation is. He picked up the dog tag. He put it back in his pocket. He said, Preston, you have 2 choices. He said, choice number 1, you sign the strip mall back to the previous owner today, at whatever price he can afford. You write a check to my diner for the full cost of damages. You write a personal check to the veterans organization I will name for you an amount that will be significant. You leave Arizona. You go wherever you and your wife decide to go. You do not come back. You do not call. You do not write. You cease to exist to every man downstairs, to the Brotherhood, to this chapter, to me. Preston said, and choice 2. Walter said, you don't do any of that. And every brother you saw downstairs makes you his personal project for the rest of your professional life. We don't use violence. Violence is simple. What we do is slower and more complete. Every deal you ever try to close will know your name before you can get to the table. Every bank that considers lending to you gets a call. Every room you walk into has already heard the full story of what you did this morning, with the flag and the dog tag and all of it. You will spend the rest of your working life explaining yourself to people who already know the answer. He looked at Preston steadily. He said, which one? Something moved in Preston's face, not the performed emotion of a man in a difficult negotiation, something deeper and less voluntary. His own brother had served, Preston had not. His brother had done one tour in Iraq in 2005 and come home, and they had never talked about it properly, the way men from families like theirs did not talk about things like that. His brother had come home quieter, and Preston had not asked why, and now sitting in his corner office with Walter Briggs's dead brother's dog tag just returned to a vest pocket across the desk. Preston felt the specific nauseating shame of a man who has done something unforgivable, not out of malice but out of ignorance, and who is now understanding fully what that ignorance cost. He said the first one. He said it clearly without hesitation. I'll take the first one. Walter reached into his jacket and produced a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and laid it on the desk. A handwritten list. The previous owner's name and contact number. The name of the veterans organization. A number. Not a small number. He said, you have until end of business today to make the calls. I'll know if you don't. Preston looked at the list. He looked at Walter. He said, I'm sorry, I didn't know what I was doing. Walter said, I know. That's what I said. He looked at Preston for a long moment. Something in his face that was not warmth and not coldness, but a third thing. A kind of vast, tired recognition of the way the world worked and had always worked, the way men without context did terrible things, and the way those things had to be answered. He stood. He said, "There's one more thing." He stepped forward. Preston flinched. Walter said, "You put your hands on me this morning." He moved 3 times. Knee to Preston's ribs, forearm across his throat controlled precise, palm flat against his sternum, with enough force to put him against the wall behind his chair. Preston hit the wall and slid down to the floor, gasping. His chair tipped beside him. Walter looked down at him. He said, "That settles that." He turned. He walked to the door. Boone was already there. At the threshold, Walter stopped and turned back. He looked at Preston on the floor. He said, "Tomorrow morning. The diner. 8 o'clock. You bring a check, and you bring whatever's left of your dignity, and you bring an apology directed specifically at my waitress, because she has worked in that diner for 20 years, and she did not deserve what you brought in there this morning." He paused. He said, "And one more thing. Don't ever put your hands on a man's flag anywhere for the rest of your life." He walked out. Boone looked at Preston on the floor for a long moment. The expression on his face was the expression of a father looking at the consequences of a choice his daughter had made without full information, a choice he had partly enabled by keeping his two worlds separate for too long. The face of a man paying a debt he had owed for a very long time. He said, "I'll call Diana. She'll meet you at home." He walked out. The door closed. Preston sat on the floor of his own office with the handwritten list on the desk above him and the folded flag beside it. He stayed on the floor for a while. He did not cry immediately. He sat there and he thought about things he had not allowed himself to think about for a very long time. He thought about the men downstairs, the 70-odd men who had ridden from every corner of the state because a phone call had gone out. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person someone called like that. He thought about what he had spent the last 10 years building and what it added up to, and whether any of it meant anything in that specific way, the way those 70 phone calls meant something. He thought about his brother. He thought about calling his brother. Eventually, he got up off the floor. He straightened his jacket. He picked up the list from the desk. He picked up his phone. He made the first call. Outside in the parking lot around the glass building, engines were starting. One by one, then in clusters, then all at once, the sound building from individual notes into the full chord of a formation that had assembled for a purpose and had served it and was now ready to go home. Walter sat on his bike in the front of the formation. He had not started his engine yet. He was looking at his phone. He had one call to make before the ride back. He dialed Ruth. She picked up on the first ring. He said, "Ruth." She said, "Walt." He said, "We're on our way back. Should be there by 3. She said, "I'll have coffee ready." He said, "How's the flag?" A brief pause. She said, "I stitched it up. The tear where the hook came through. It's not invisible. You can see where it happened." He said, "Good." She said, "Good." He said, "It should be visible. Things that get hurt and get fixed should show where they were hurt. Otherwise, you can't tell what they survived." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Walt, are you all right?" He said, "I'm all right, Ruth." He started his engine. The sound of it joined the sounds of the others and became part of the larger sound, the sound of the column reassembling the sound of the formation that had come to Phoenix for a reason and was now going home. Walter pulled out of the parking lot onto the street. He turned north. He pointed the bike toward the highway, toward Route 93, toward Wickenburg in the desert and the diner. Behind him in formation, 2 by 2, the column fell in. Diana had been sitting on the front steps of her house in Scottsdale when Preston pulled into the driveway, still in her workout clothes from the morning. She had been crying and had stopped. Her hands were folded in her lap. When his car pulled in, she stood. He got out of the car. She looked at him, at the way he was moving, at his face. She said, "Are you hurt?" He said, "Not seriously." She said, "Preston, I should have told you a long time ago. I'm sorry." He stood in the driveway. He looked at the house he had bought 3 years ago, beautiful and measured in the specific vocabulary of Phoenix area luxury real estate, and he felt it as a backdrop rather than a home, the way a set is a backdrop rather than a place. He said, "Your father's a good man." She looked at him carefully. He said, "I know that now. I should have known it before." He said, "I have some calls to make tonight." He said, "Diana." I was thinking about Oregon, somewhere with trees. I was thinking about starting over somewhere. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked down the steps and she put her arms around him and he stood in the driveway holding her. And he thought about Danny Briggs and about phones and about dog tags carried in vest pockets for 20 years and about the things that matter and how you only understand what they are after you have put your shoe on one of them. He made his calls at the kitchen table that night. She sat across from him and did not go to another room. She had spent 7 years going to other rooms when the business calls happened. Tonight she sat at the kitchen table and listened, because what he was doing at that table was dismantling the thing that had brought them to this morning, and she wanted to witness it. The calls took 2.5 hours. When the last one was done, he put the phone face down on the table. He said, "It's done. The strip mall goes back. The hotel project is canceled." She said, "Where do you want to go?" He said, "Oregon, somewhere with trees." He said, "I've been in cities my whole life." She said, "Dad used to take me camping when I was small, before I was old enough to know which parts of his life to ask about." She said, "I'd like trees." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." Outside the kitchen window, the Phoenix night had settled fully, the city lights spreading out to the horizon, the desert beyond the city dark and enormous. She looked at the city lights and thought that tomorrow morning Preston would drive out to Wickenburg and walk into a diner and do the hardest thing he had ever done, and that what came after that would be a different life. She was not frightened of the different life. She realized sitting at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in October relieved. The ride back took an hour and 40 minutes. The October afternoon was cooling toward evening as Walter came off the highway at the Route 93 exit, the air off the desert dry and clear and smelling of dust and sage. He turned into the diner lot and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. Around him, one by one, the others cut their engines too. The quiet spread. 73 bikes in the lot of a small diner on Route 93, and a silence that was not empty but full, the way silences are full when the men inside them have done something that needed doing. Walter got off the bike. He looked at the diner. The cardboard Ruth had put in the broken window frame was visible from here, brown against the wall, held in place with packing tape. The parking lot light above the door was on. Through the cardboard, he could see the warm yellow light of the diner's interior. He walked to the door. He opened it. The bell rang. Ruth looked up from behind the counter. The coffee was ready. She had set out cups. Walter walked to the wall. He pressed the folded flag back over the hook as carefully as he could, the stitches Ruth had put in visible and careful in the yellow light. He stepped back. The flag was on the wall. He went to his booth and sat down. Ruth came over and poured his coffee without asking. She looked at the flag. She said, "The stitches show." He said, "Good." She said it again, softer. "Good." She went back behind the counter. Walter picked up his coffee cup. Outside in the lot, men were saying their goodbyes. Engines were starting in ones and twos as brothers began the rides back to wherever they had come from. The sound of each engine starting was like a period at the end of a sentence, then quiet again. Walter drank his coffee. The morning had been very long. The day had been very long. He was 67 years old and he had not slept since before 4 in the morning, and he had ridden 2 hours in each direction, and he had done what needed to be done. His lips still had the cut on it, small and sealed. His hands were steady on the coffee cup. He thought about Danny, not with grief anymore, not exactly, but with a kind of present tense awareness that Danny was gone and that the world was different because of it, and that the diner and the flag and the dog tag were the way he kept that difference visible. The way he kept Danny from becoming abstract. The way he kept him from becoming just a name on a stone somewhere in Wyoming. Ruth came over with a plate of eggs and set it in front of him without asking. He looked up at her. She said, "Cleve loved this place. He said to me once that the best thing about riding was finding places where you were known. He said this diner was a place where he was known." Walter listened. She said, "I come here every morning because Cleve would have, and because I want to, and because the flag on that wall is the reason both of those things are true. Danny never knew me, but in a way I've been keeping his flag company for 20 years. She looked at the wall, and I'm glad about it. I'm glad it got fixed. Walter looked at her. He said, "Ruth, thank you for fixing it." She said, "The stitches aren't invisible." He said, "That's how it should be." She went back behind the counter. He ate his eggs. The last of the brothers were leaving the lot. One engine, then silence. Then it was just the diner and Ruth behind the counter and the flag on the wall and Walter in his booth with his coffee and his eggs in the October night coming down outside. He thought about Boone, about what Boone had done in that office, standing there not looking at his son-in-law being present for something that cost him. The thing about Boone was that he was the kind of man who paid his debts in full. He always had been. When something needed to be paid, he paid it himself. Standing in that office was a debt. The debt of having kept his world separate for too long, of not telling Diana what she needed to know. Boone had stood there and been present for it and let it be real. That was how a man paid that kind of debt. Walter finished his eggs. Ruth came by and refilled his coffee. She said, "Walt?" He looked up. She said, "Walt, I've been here 20 years and I didn't know." "Not really. About all of it. About what it meant." She looked at the flag. "I knew Cleve Road. I knew the patches. But I didn't know the weight of it." She said, "Today was the first time I really understood." Walter said Cleve was a good man. She said he was. He said you were good for him. She said he was better for me. They sat with that for a moment. Then she went back behind the counter, and he sat in his booth and drank his coffee and let the quiet of the diner settle around him like something earned. Preston Harlow arrived at the diner at 7:58 the next morning. He drove alone. He had told Diana he needed to do this alone, and she had understood. He had driven the 2 hours from Phoenix in the early morning dark with the radio off, watching the highway unroll in his headlights, through the flat desert landscape, the saguaros standing at intervals along the roadside like sentinels that had always been there and would always be there after he was gone. He pulled into the parking lot. He sat with the engine running for a full minute. He looked at the diner. The cardboard patch was gone. A new window had been put in overnight, the glass clean and clear, reflecting the pale early morning sky. The parking lot light above the door was still on. Inside, through the new glass, he could see the warm light of the interior. A figure behind the counter, another figure in the corner booth. He cut the engine. He sat for another moment. He thought about what he needed to say and how he needed to say it. He was a man accustomed to preparation, to knowing what he was going to say before he said it, to controlling the terms of a conversation. He knew those skills would not serve him here. What was needed was something simpler and harder. He opened the car door. He got out. He was dressed plainly, jeans and a dark shirt, no tie, no jacket. His bandaged hand he had thought about hiding and then had not. The bandage was part of it. The bandage was the visible record of what had happened, and he owed this man the visible record. He walked to the door. He put his hand on it. He opened it. The bell rang. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and butter, and something that was simply time, years of meals and mornings compressed into the smell of the walls. The new window was clean. The floor had been swept and mopped. The ceramic mugs on the back shelf had been replaced, lined up in the same positions as before, different mugs, but in the same positions. The counter had been wiped down, and the flag was on the wall. Preston saw it the moment he walked in. He had been prepared to see it. He had thought he was prepared. But seeing it on the wall back in its place, the stitches visible at the corner where the tear had been repaired, the colors faded, and the dark stain in the upper corner that he now understood was blood, he stopped walking for a moment and looked at it. He had put his shoe on that. The understanding of what he had done had been arriving in pieces since Walter had sat across from him and told him about Danny, and each piece was worse than the one before it. Not because what he had done was worse than he had initially understood, because he himself was smaller than he had believed himself to be, and the correction of that belief was ongoing and painful. Ruth was behind the counter. She was wiping down the coffee station, watching him from across the room with an expression that was not angry and not warm but steady, and level the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal in her life and has learned to wait and see before deciding what to feel. Walter was in the corner booth, same as always, gray beard, silver hair, leather vest. The newspaper folded on the table, a cup of coffee. He had looked up when the bell rang. He was watching Preston now. Preston walked to the counter first. He stopped in front of Ruth. He put his hands on the counter, the bandaged one and the unbandaged one, both of them visible. He said, "Ma'am," he said, "I'm here to apologize to you for what I did to your workplace yesterday morning. I broke things that belong to you and to this place, and I did it knowing you would have to deal with the aftermath. That was wrong. It was disrespectful. I am sorry." He took an envelope from his back pocket and set it on the counter. He said, "That's a check for the damages. The mugs, the window, anything I missed. If it's not enough, tell me and I'll make it right." Ruth looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "The window man charged $850. I replaced the mugs at the thrift store for 14. He said the check is for 10,000. She looked at the envelope again. She said, "That's too much." He said, "It's what I owe." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "You want coffee?" He said, "Yes, please." She poured him a cup. He took it and turned and walked to the corner booth. Walter looked up from his newspaper. He folded it and set it aside. He gestured at the seat across from him. Preston sat down. He set the coffee cup in front of him. He set a second envelope on the table. He said, "Mr. Briggs." He stopped. He said, "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since yesterday afternoon. I don't think there are words for it. I think anything I say sounds like an excuse or an explanation, and you don't need either one of those from me." He looked at the flag on the wall. He said, "I know what it is now, what it cost." He said, "My brother did a tour in Iraq in 2005. He came home, and I never asked him about it. I thought I was giving him space. I think I was afraid to know." He said, "I understand now what that means, what it costs a man to carry something home." Walter listened. He did not fill in the silence or offer anything to make it easier. Preston said, "I've signed the strip mall back to the previous owner. At cost. His name is Gerald Fitch. He had it for 20 years before me. He'll call today. The hotel project is canceled." He said, "My wife and I are leaving Arizona." He pushed the second envelope across the table. He said, "That's for the veterans organization you named, the amount you specified." He said, "I also called the Army Veterans Center in Phoenix this morning. I made a donation there as well in your brother's name. Danny Briggs, I asked them to note it that way." Something moved in Walter's face, just briefly, the way a light changes when a cloud moves across it and moves away. Walter looked at the envelope. He picked it up. He set it in his inside vest pocket without opening it. He said, "I'll see that it gets there." He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He set it down. He said, "Preston." He said the name without hostility, simply using it the way you use a person's name when you want them to know they are being addressed as a person and not as a situation. He said, "I don't know what kind of man you're going to be after this. I know what kind you were before it. Those two things don't have to be the same." Preston said no. Walter said, "The deal we made yesterday still stands. You go and you don't come back and you don't exist to us. That's not a punishment. It's a door. You walk through it and the rest of your life is yours to do something with." Preston nodded. Walter said, "The thing about men who do what you did is that they usually don't know what they did. They know they got consequences, but they don't understand the specific thing." He said, "I think you know. I think you understand it now." Preston said, "I do." Walter said, "Good." He said, "Then go." Preston stood. He held out his right hand, the unbandaged one. He held it out and waited, knowing it might not be taken, and that if it was not taken, that was the right answer too, that he had not earned the right to expect anything from this man. Walter looked at the hand for a moment. Then he reached out and shook it. Brief, firm, final. Preston said, "Thank you, sir." Walter said, "Travel safe." Preston walked to the door. The bell rang. He walked out. Through the new window, Walter watched him cross the parking lot, get in his car, start the engine, and drive away onto Route 93 heading south. He watched the car until it was small and then gone around the bend in the highway. He picked up his coffee. He drank. Ruth came over with the pot. She refilled his cup without asking. She looked out the window where Preston's car had been. She said, "Was that all right?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think he meant it?" He said, "I think he's going to try to mean it. I think that's all anybody can do." She nodded. She went back behind the counter. A reporter arrived at 8:15, a woman from the local paper named Sandra, who had called Ruth the night before. She sat at the counter with her small camera and her notebook and drank coffee and asked Ruth a few questions and photographed the flag on the wall and the stitches at the corner and the new window glass. She asked Walter one question. She said, "Mr. Briggs, what would you want people to know about what happened here?" Walter looked at the flag. He thought about it. He said, "I'd want them to know that some things don't have a price, not because they're precious, because they're irreplaceable. There's a difference. Precious things can be replaced with something equally precious. Irreplaceable things can't be replaced at all. You either still have them or you don't. He said that flag is irreplaceable. The diner is irreplaceable, not because of their dollar value, because of what they are. Sandra wrote that down. She thanked him. She finished her coffee. She left. Walter read his newspaper. The morning came on the way, mornings due in October in the Arizona desert. Slowly at first, the light expanding the shadows of the saguaro, stretching long across the sand, and shortening as the sun rose. The temperature climbing from the cold of the early hours toward the cool comfort of a desert autumn day. Regulars came in. Gerald, who drove propane, same as always. Faye from the ranch 12 miles south. The two men from the county road crew. The retired school teacher from Wickenburg, who always left $1 over the bill. Each of them looked at the new window. Each of them looked at the flag. Most of them said nothing. Some of them said, "Morning, Walt." He said it back. At 9:45, the bell rang again. Walter looked up. A young man walked in, 22, maybe 23, crew cut, Marine Corps tattoo on his left forearm, the ink still dark and crisp, not yet worn at the edges the way old tattoos get. He wore jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, and he moved in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has recently been in a place where moving carelessly had consequences. He sat down at the counter. He looked at the menu Ruth handed him. He said, "Eggs and bacon, please. Black coffee." Ruth poured the coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup and held it for a moment before drinking the way men who have been in cold places do, even when the room is warm. He looked around the diner slowly. His eyes went to the wall. He looked at the flag. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that Ruth, coming around with a coffee refill, noticed him looking. He said, "Ma'am, that flag on the wall, did something happen to it?" He was looking at the stitches at the corner. Ruth looked over at Walter. Walter gave her a small nod. She said, "Somebody tried to hurt it, sweetheart, but we fixed it." The young man looked at the stitches. He looked at the faded colors, the darkened corner, the general quality of something old and cared for and present. He said, "It's old." Ruth said, 19 years on that wall." He looked at it a moment more. Then he turned back to his coffee and was quiet. When his food came, he started to reach for his wallet. Walter spoke from his booth. He said, "Marine, your money's no good in here." The young man turned. He looked at Walter. He saw the gray beard and the silver hair and the patches on the vest and the cut healing on the lower lip and the eyes. The eyes of a man who had been something for a very long time and who still was. He said, "Sir." Walter said, "On the house. Welcome home." The young man's jaw tightened. He looked for a moment at the counter. He looked at the flag. He looked at Walter. His eyes filled up in the way that the eyes of young men who have been trying very hard to be steady will sometimes fill up when someone speaks directly to them. He said, "Thank you, sir." Walter said, "Eat your breakfast, son." The young man ate. He ate slowly and thoroughly the eggs and bacon and the toast that Ruth had put on the side without him asking. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the diner, at the other people in it, at the morning light. When he was done, he sat for a moment. Then he got up and walked over to Walter's booth. He put out his hand. Walter shook it. The young man said, "Sir, can I ask about the flag?" Walter looked at the flag for a long moment. He said, "Sit down if you want." The young man sat. Walter said, "My brother's name was Danny." He said it the way you say a name when it matters. He said he was 7 years younger than me. I enlisted in 1975. He followed me into the Marines 20-some years later because that's what younger brothers do. He said he deployed to Afghanistan in 2003. He was killed in September of 2004. He said they folded the flag over his casket and his wife put it in my hands and I hung it on that wall the day I opened this place. The young man listened. He did not look away. Walter said, "The stain in the upper left corner is his blood." He cut his hand on a piece of equipment during a training exercise the year before he deployed. He wiped it on the flag without thinking. He said, "I never washed it out." The young man looked at the flag. He looked at the stain. He said, "When did you last see him?" Walter said, "December of 2003. He came home for Christmas. I made eggs. We sat in a booth like this one and we drank coffee and we talked about things I don't entirely remember, and then he drove to the airport. I watched his rental car pull out of the lot. That was the last time." The young man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sir, I lost a friend over there, a corpsman. His name was Torres. He said it the way people say names they are careful with. Walter said, "I'm sorry." The young man said, "I keep thinking I should have." He stopped. He said, "I keep going back over it." Walter said, "You'll do that." He said, "That doesn't stop. But it changes. The going back over it changes. You start to carry it differently, not less. Differently." The young man said, "How?" Walter thought about it. He said, "You find something to do with it." He said, "Not instead of it, alongside it." He looked at the diner around him, at the regulars at their tables, at the flag on the wall, at the new window glass catching the morning light. He said, "This is what I did with it." He reached inside his vest. He took out the dog tag. He held it out so the young man could see it. The worn metal, the stamped letters. Briggs Danny R. He said, "I've carried this since the funeral, every day for 20 years. The young man looked at the dog tag. He looked at Walter. Walter closed his hand around it and put it back in his inside pocket over his chest. He said, "What's your name?" The young man said, "Jake. Jake Sutton." Walter said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Montana, Missoula." Walter said, "What are you going to do next?" Jake said he wasn't sure yet. He said he had just finished his discharge processing. He was driving back to Missoula. He had pulled off the highway because he needed coffee and the diner had a light on. Walter said, "You eat enough?" Jake said, "Yes, sir." Walter said, "Then you're all set." Jake looked at him for a moment. He said, "Sir, what you said about carrying it differently." Walter said, "Yes." Jake said, "Is that true? Does that happen?" Walter looked at him. He said, "I'm 67 years old. I've been carrying Danny for 20 years. I came in this morning, same as every morning, made my coffee, sat in this booth, read my paper." He said, "And yeah, it's different now than it was in 2004. Not smaller, different." He said, "You'll find what it becomes." He said, "That's the work." Jake Sutton nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away, something he intended to return to. He stood up. He put out his hand again. Walter shook it again. Jake said, "Thank you for breakfast and for this." He looked at the flag one more time. Walter said, "Safe travels, Jake." Jake walked to the door. The bell rang. He walked out. Through the new window, Walter watched him cross the parking lot to a pickup truck with Montana plates. Jake sat in the truck for a moment, still looking straight ahead at something that was not the parking lot. Then he started the engine and drove out onto Route 93 heading north. Walter watched until the truck was gone. At 3:30, Walter's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Cole, Danny's son, 20 years old, junior year at the University of Wyoming, studying civil engineering the way his father had. Cole called on Danny's birthday and at Christmas and occasionally in between. Walter picked up. Cole said, "I heard." Walter said, "How?" Cole said, "Boone called me. He said he thought I should know. He said it was about Dad's flag, and he thought Dad's son should know what happened and how it came out." Walter looked at the flag on the wall. Cole said, "Is it okay, the flag?" Walter said, "It's okay. Ruth fixed it. It's on the wall." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Uncle Walt, can I come down?" "Not right now, maybe spring break." "Can I come to the diner?" Walter said, "Cole, anytime you want. You don't have to ask." Cole said, "I want to see it." The flag. Dad talked about the diner. He said, "You built it right after." He said, "I want to see what he talked about." Walter's hand was tight on the phone. He said, "You come in March. I'll have the eggs ready." Cole said, "Okay." He said, "Uncle Walt." Walter said, "Yeah." Cole said, "Thank you for keeping it, the flag. Thank you for not taking it down." Walter said, "It's his. It stays." Cole said, "I love you, Uncle Walt." Walter said, "I love you too, Cole." He hung up. Boone had called Cole. That was the extraordinary thing. Boone had understood without being asked that Danny's son deserved to know that his father's flag had been defended, that men had ridden from 5 states when it was put on the floor, that an old man in Arizona had been carrying his father's dog tag for 20 years and was still carrying it and would carry it for however many years were left. Cole deserved to know that his father was remembered, that the remembering was serious, that it took the form of eggs and coffee and a flag on a wall and 70 bikes on a Tuesday morning. At 5 o'clock, Walter started the closing routine. He wiped down the grill, covered the prep station, put the leftover ingredients in the cooler. He swept the floor. He wiped down the counter and the tables. He tallied the register. He turned off the lights one by one until only the counter light was on. Ruth had already gone home. She had said goodnight at 4:30, same as always. He had the diner to himself. He did the last of the closing tasks slowly. There was nowhere he needed to be. Tomorrow would begin again at 4 in the morning with the coffee and the grill and the flag on the wall, and that was fine. That was the whole point. He turned off the counter light. In the near dark of the diner, the only illumination was the outside parking lot light coming through the new window glass, a pale rectangle of light falling across the floor and the counter and climbing the wall. It fell on the flag the way a searchlight falls on something it has been looking for. Walter stood in the dark diner and looked at the flag in the window light. He had looked at it thousands of times, every morning when he opened and every evening when he closed. In every kind of light, in every season, in every mood he had passed through over 19 years. He had looked at it when he was tired and when he was steady and when he was grieving and when he was not. He had looked at it on the days when Danny felt close and the days when Danny felt distant. Tonight he looked at it and felt something that was not any one emotion, but the accumulation of all of them. The way a river is not any single drop of water, but the total of everything that has flowed through it. He looked at the stitches Ruth had put in, small, careful, slightly too bright, visible. He thought about what he had said to her. Things that get hurt and get fixed should show where they were hurt. Otherwise, you can't tell what they survived. The flag was more itself now. The stitches were not an imperfection. They were a record. They said this happened and it was answered, and here is the evidence of both. He stood in the dark for a while. Then he reached into his inside vest pocket and took out the dog tag. He held it in his open palm in the light from the window. Briggs Danny R. He closed his hand around it. He pressed it against his chest. He said quietly to the dark diner and the flag on the wall, "Good night, Danny." He stood there for a moment. Then he tucked the dog tag back into his pocket and walked to the door. He opened it. The October night came in cool and dry and smelling of desert. He stepped outside. He locked the door behind him. He crossed the parking lot to his bike. He threw his leg over it and kicked it to life. He sat for a moment with the engine idling. He looked at the diner, the sign, the new window, the parking lot light, the closed door. He pulled out onto Route 93 and headed north toward home. Far down the highway, a pair of headlights appeared approaching from the south. As they got closer, Walter could see it was a single bike, a Harley running lights on Riding Easy. As it passed, the rider raised a hand. Walter raised his back. The bike disappeared in his mirror, heading south, going somewhere in the dark. He rode on. The desert was large around him, and the sky above it was enormous and full of stars. The kind of sky that exists only in places far from city light, the kind that makes a man feel the accurate scale of things, which is not diminishment, but proportion. He thought about what he had told Jake Sutton, about carrying it differently, about finding what it becomes. He had said it as though he knew it to be true, and it was true in the way that things become true over time, not all at once, but gradually through the long work of years. The weight of Danny had not become lighter, but the way he distributed it across his life had changed. The diner was part of that. The flag was part of that. The brotherhood was part of that. The 4 a.m. mornings and the coffee and the eggs and the regulars, all of it, part of the structure he had built, not to escape the grief, but to give it somewhere to live that was also useful, also warm, also capable of feeding people and flying a flag and saying to anyone who came through the door, "This is a place that remembers." He had built a place that remembers. That was what it had become. He thought about Cole coming in March. He thought about Cole sitting in the booth across from him, the way Danny had sat in December of 2003, drinking coffee, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't. And then he thought about Cole standing in front of the flag, the way he had done twice before, standing quietly and not saying anything. He thought about what Cole would see now that he would not have seen before. The stitches, the record of what had happened and been answered. He would be here. The diner would be here. The flag would be on the wall. Some men carry a weight you cannot see from the outside. They look like old men. They look like the world has worn them down. But what the world has worn down is sometimes also what the world has hardened and shaped the way the desert shapes stone, not by force alone, but by time, by years of wind and weather, until the stone becomes what it was always going to become. Walter Briggs was 67 years old. He had carried his brother's dog tag for 20 years. He had built a diner and hung a flag on the wall, and gotten up at 4 in the morning for 19 years and made the coffee and made the eggs and opened the door. He had built a place that remembers, and no one had taken it from him. And no one was going to. He rode on into the Arizona night, and the stars were out, and the desert was quiet, and somewhere ahead of him, invisible in the dark, the road continued on. That was enough. That had always been enough.